Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Welcome back, everybody. If you are a business leader, you work with a team, I'm sure you've been confronted with this situation before. Somebody makes an error, a mistake on your team. How do you handle it? Think about that for a moment. Might surprise you in knowing that you're probably not dealing with it the way you should. We're going to talk with somebody who can provide insight on that. He's somebody that offers guaranteed and measurable leadership growth for you and your team. If you're an entrepreneur, an individual, you're looking for a coach that can help you with this and many other challenges, this is your guy right here. It's Randy Swaim with coachingforrelevance.com. Welcome back, Randy. How you doing?
Hey, good there, man. Good to see you. Good to see you. It's always an honor to be on with you. So you bet. Glad to be here.
Great having you here. You always give us a lot to think about. I'm processing this whole topic today. So, what do you do when somebody on your team makes a mistake?
Yeah. And what I would also throw out a little bit is, to what level do you have clarity on how you need to adapt how you do that versus it's going in a good direction? And on what basis do you say that? And so all of that can come into play with this. And a lot of it will inundate from some of the stuff that we've talked about for the last 2 weeks. Sure. About neuroscience and how that really comes into play with this, and the how the brain energizes the chemicals and all that, kind of thing to generate it. We were talking about how the right way of that is now versus what the decades ago thing that was taught was not exactly correct. But this is sort of an outflow of what we talked about with that. And the point is, when you're talking, and particularly when you're talking about a challenging, unpredictable environment that isn't just totally rote, you know what? Your team may be in a situation where perhaps they were not as effective because they were perhaps assuming that this is the way it's supposed to be or whatever. But if you have somebody on your team that made a mistake or didn't do something at the right time or whatever, what I throw out to the listeners is, how have you typically handled that in the past, kind of thing? Because if you go with what so many sort of old school narcissistic managers have sort of been taught to do, it's almost like, I just got to tell you what to do. You just do what I told you to do and leave it at that, kind of thing. And there's a couple of real downsides to that. And one of them is that you're shutting their brain off, because you know what? I guess he just wants me to shut up and do what he tells me to do. But you would be surprised at even how many pilot instructors and how many instructors in a professional arena like that I have heard, when they got situations, or you talked about situations that can come up. And you've heard me say this, Steve, before, that even in flight crews and pilots, guess what? Murphy's Law can come on the stage today. The old Murphy's Law of the worst thing that can happen is destined to happen today on this whatever, and kind of thing. And you'd be surprised, though, that how many times I've heard people say, well, this should have just been like this, because their brain was completely going back to a remote academic thing. But here's the thing. If in a new, unique scenario that your team has not totally faced before, if somebody on your team wasn't quite as effective, maybe didn't do the one thing that could have made miraculous results out of it, possibly, how do you really handle it as the manager and the leader of your team? Because a lot of times you'll have people come across and do kind of what that one or two instructors that I mentioned there, didn't mention them by name, and I'm not going to, and won't tell you where in the industry or anything like that. But you can't say, well, it should have just done this. Okay. My question to the listeners is, when you walk up to your team member what questions do you need to ask him? Get off of this mindset of just telling him, you should have done this, you should have done this, I'll tell you what to do next time or whatever. What questions should you have asked them? And I shared on one of our radio shows, I think a couple of months ago, that there was a client in the flight simulator that, and you may remember that he, when I failed an engine on his takeoff, it went way off to the side of the runway. And I froze the sim because it wasn't appropriate. It wasn't successful, but I froze the sim. But my only question to him was, what was the root cause of that? Now, most people, even in perhaps teaching or developing or leading teams today, would just simply say, well, you should have done this. You should have done this, because there's an insidious aspect that they don't have what it takes to process, develop, gain insight, and see and apply. And the bottom line is, if all you're doing is telling them what they should have done, you're shutting their brains down, and you're not building them to be able to be functional in a challenging situation. This particular guy, I got him talking through it about what was the root cause of the situation. And it blew him away a little bit. And I said, okay, you got some insight now. I said, want to try another one? He said, you bet. And this time he nailed it to perfection throughout. So much that the other pilot that was flying with him was like, wow, kind of thing. But he gained insight. I did not tell him what to do. I asked him. I asked him some questions so that he could process correctly and figure it out himself and apply it because of his awareness. And the bottom line is, when you're talking about leading teams in sometimes an unpredictable, challenging situation, guess what? Sometimes you got to do that. And there's been one or two times in my career where I've had to do that with people. And it really worked because of the way that I did it. And a lot of times you come up to the person, you say, well, what was your perception? Now, I know in my mind what I observed. I know what the perception seemed to be of what went wrong. Okay. But if I come up and I ask him, in your understanding and your vision of this and your experience, what was the problem? And that's kind of what I did with this client. And sometimes you got to give them a minute to think through it for a second. And a lot of times they'll give you a superficial academic answer, and you go, okay, how does that play out in this? Oh, yeah. Well, what made that happen? Oh, yeah. When you see that in the future, how are you going to be aware of that slightly sooner? Possibly. Okay. And then what are you going to do about it? And how are you going to know it's the right thing to do? And the bottom line is, if you get this sort of facilitative coaching leadership style in your people in a scenario and experience that is not always academic, they can develop and become what you want them to be, so that you can get dramatic results that nobody else would have ever believed. And they're better. And so it's just something to think about. But like I said, if you just come in with what a lot of people sort of think about in today's world, and all you do is point fingers and tell them, you screwed this up, you shouldn't have done this, you should have done this. What you're doing is, when you think about the neuroscience aspect, there's a couple of things that you're doing that are very negative. One is you're shutting their processing down, and they're basically sensing and experiencing from you that they don't have what it takes. And if you think your boss doesn't think you have what it takes, why would you step forward?
Do you think in those situations, Randy, when that happens, when they make a mistake and you're like, why'd you do that? What's going on? Do you think they just switch into autopilot? They disconnect?
Thank you. That's not a bad way to put it. And if I was coaching you, my next question would be, what makes them do that? And you know what? What makes them do that is the interaction of their manager, or the mindset and the culture that their manager has created in their team. And you know what? If I'm instilling the culture where it makes people just go into autopilot and shut their brain off, I'm not being successful and I'm not being a leader. And so it's a great point. And you're not a team. You're right. It's a great point that you brought up in that picture, because that's the heart of kind of where I'm going with this. But you know what? To the people that are listening, how do you need to improve how you're doing that? Because you know what? When you're talking about today's world, there's always going to be something that you could not fully predict in your team's journey and what you're trying to accomplish. There's always some factors that you couldn't have just predicted. And you know what? You may have predicted that it would come on as a little tiny thing when it comes on as a huge thing, or vice versa, kind of thing. And you know what? Those cannot be predicted. And you know what? If all you're doing is going back to a 60-year-old out-of-date mindset, where I'm just going to tell you what to do and you do it and I'll blame it on you if it doesn't work right, you're not building a team. But if you can get this insight where you help them process and develop their brain to a point where they start becoming aware early on of the unexpected factors coming on the scene without you having to tell them, guess what? Now you're really making something in your team. But it's a big aspect of this when you're talking about, how are you doing this? And for the people that are listening, I would just simply say, think back on a couple of times in your team when maybe it was kind of working out where it wasn't quite as successful or whatever. How did you really respond to that? How did you engage in that? And what do you need to do different, possibly?
So I have a question in this situation. Let's say somebody's made an error.
Mm-hmm.
And as their supervisor, you're not 100% sure they know how to fix it. And even if you ask the questions, why did that go wrong, etc., you're feeling that they're not really getting it. At what point do you jump in and tell them this is what needs to get done? And I mean that in a very positive way.
No, I understand that. But here's the thing. In one sense, when you're asking those questions as the leader and the manager, when you're asking those questions, what insights would make you sense that they don't have that? Because if the person goes like this and goes, you know what? That's a good question. And I don't know. Now you can jump in and work together with them as a team and start visualizing that. But if you go into a point where the person is just making excuses for everything and everything they respond to you, well, this should have been like, this is just so stupid. That should have never happened. And you'd be surprised at how many people in my journey I have heard say that kind of thing. And you know what? If you hear somebody doing like that as a leader, you may have to step in and put the roadblock on that. And so, but there's a sense where when you're working with your team, even though they're going through sort of a struggling moment and coming alongside and achieving, there's a sense where they sit there and go, you know what? And this is a key thing that when you're talking about being a leader, you want to create this in your team. There's a sense where they say, you know what? My leader realized that I screwed this up. But you know what? My leader still believes in me. You know what? I want to make this work. And I think I shared this with you in a previous show probably a couple of months ago. But there was a lady client who was a nice lady. She was trying to be very professional and all that. I gave her a check ride in a airplane, a practical test. So with a practical test, you can't fail anything, on this side of the Atlantic Ocean anyway. And there was one maneuver that she failed. And the chief pilot actually called me. The chief pilot and the director of ops for their company called me as the examiner. And I told them, I said, listen, she's going to be a good teammate for you guys in your operation. Would I fly with her? Yeah, I would. Was there just one critical thing she did wrong on the check ride? Yep, there was just one. But I think she'll be fine after we do the retest on that one thing. And you could tell she was nervous. She was almost she almost sort of felt beat up. But when it came time for the recheck, where all we had to do was that one maneuver, and she nailed it nicely. And I said, okay, put the gear down. We came back down off of motion and stuff. And she, and I mean, immediately she was overly apologetic for the frustration that she was kind of exhibiting, kind of earlier. And she was, and I told her, I said, I had a conversation with the chief pilot and I told him this. And I said, I'll fly with you any day. And she was very overly apologetic to it. And I looked at her like this. I said, I want you to understand something. She said, what's that? And I said, you don't have to apologize for anything. Because I realized that all you were doing is going through a struggling moment for a minute. And so you weren't being mad at anybody else. You weren't being vindictive at anybody else. But you were just getting through it. And she was so appreciative of that. In fact, just as a brother and sister in aviation, after it was all done, she came up and gave me just a friendly hug kind of thing. And I said, you go, girl, you got what it takes, kind of thing. And but do you interact with your people at a struggling moment in a way where they believe in your belief in them? If my manager's talking to me and are just accusing and all this, do I have a sense that they do not believe in me? Why am I even on this team? This is crazy. Why waste my time? Kind of thing. As opposed to, you know what? I can do better. And you know what? I'm going to look at what I need to do to develop and be better and make that more effective next time. And you know what? My manager, my leader believes in me. And I'm going to prove it to them with what they believe, that they're right. And that's a whole different mindset when you talk about coming together at a point where there's a kind of a momentary failure or something that doesn't work out as effectively. As a leader, how are you really doing that with your team? Because if you're just shutting them down and making them feel like you just better do what I say, you're nothing, kind of, that kind of thing, you're hurting your team. But if it's something where they say, you know what, my manager believes that I can do this, and you know what, I'm going to prove it to him. I'm going to show it to him. I'm going to make this get better. And they take it on themselves. And guess what? All of those chemicals that the brain releases are a whole lot more positive than the other way. And so it's just a key aspect with this whole concept.
So question, and I mean this in a positive way.
Sure.
And it's only going to come out one way.
That's understand, buddy. I understand.
Way. Should you, in some regards, almost treat your team like children? Again, I mean this in a positive way, where you're nurturing them and you're making them think for themselves. Is it a little bit like that?
In that one perspective, perhaps so, but realize that they have a level of knowledge, otherwise they probably wouldn't be there. But the situations that apply in today's world may not always fit your rote academic mindset. And you know what? Are you leading yourself? And it's not so much, I want to hesitate from the word treating them like children, but with what you said, I understand kind of where you're going and I agree with it, because it's like, as a leader, am I letting myself be developed further and further?
No, that's a really great point.
Yeah. And you know what, when I'm working with my people, maybe that's something I have to get better at.
And the only way you're going to get better at it is if you work together. They're not going to realize that you're really working on yourself at the same time. And you might have a realization after that one situation where something wasn't performed properly. You might turn around and say, wow, that actually went pretty good. And they seem happy. I'm happy. And they did it right. The second time.
And you know what? The second time, when you walk up to them and you just look at them and all you do is you wink at them and say, good job. And they go, yeah, it didn't happen last time that way. Yeah, but you know what? It did this time.
Right.
It says something about you. Glad you're on the team, buddy. I mean, it's those aspects when you're talking about this true leading in challenging situations and environments that, when you have somebody like that, what do you need to do differently? Go up and just point fingers and say, you should have done this, you should have done this, as opposed to asking the questions that get them processing and thinking about the factors that were involved. And also, if you do that in the future, if this comes up again, what factors might I look for that I didn't expect? And how am I going to do if they sneak on scene? And so all of these are factors that come into that for sure. But it's a key aspect of when you're understand neuroplasticity and neuroscience and how the brain really works, how you really connect with your people in such a way that dramatic, radical results can come out, where your bosses come up to you and say, man, your folks did this. What happened? Wow. And you go, yep, they did great. And so, yeah, it's a key point that sometimes people don't think about.
You just said something before, and it actually serves as a reminder. And it's so basic, but we often forget.
Yeah.
One word, praise. We all forget to do that. But what you just said, you're giving an example, and I felt good even from hearing your example.
Yeah.
Or, let's say somebody did make a mistake and then they did it again, and then you praise them more. Just praise them anyway.
Yeah. And I shared that story with you way back when I was a site manager at Griffiths Air Force Base there, when the team was kind of coming up, the pilots. I was the manager and I was the site manager and the contract rep. So I was the boss of everybody. But the people were kind of putting together some thoughts on maybe something to link it. And I was standing there and I was saying, you know what, sounds like a good idea. Let's see where they go, kind of thing. And I just let them run with it for a second. And the one of the co-pilots at the time was a guy I knew from the military as well. But he went over and he sat down with a pen and a pad and he was going to jot some notes down. And I shared this with you, but halfway down in the seat, he goes, oh, yeah, the boss is here. And he looked up at me. And all I did with him, I shared this with you before, I think, Steve, all I did with him is I looked like this and I nodded my head and I winked at him. And that's all I did. And he smiled. And he sat down and he jotted some of the notes that they were talking about, kind of thing. And it's, sometimes that praise can be in 5 seconds.
It doesn't, you don't have to do a lot.
No.
It could even just be an email that says project came out fantastic. Great work. Exclamation point. Done.
Yeah, exactly.
Or you actually personalize it. You did a great job.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? When they go out and talk to some other people in your organization, and they come up and they're blown away because of how they talked about you and their appreciation, to go, oh, well, I'm glad they think that. That's appreciated. Thanks.
I don't think there's anything better you could ask for as a manager, to have behind your back your team talking positive about you. That you've won. We got to win.
Yep.
Right?
And you know what? That's when you look at the norepinephrine aspect in the neuroscience, where it's fight or flight, that belief in all that's going on there is what makes them say, yeah, you know what? Let's make this happen. Boom. Let's get this to happen. And you don't have to fire them up, because they'll do that automatically because their belief in you and the team. And that's all of that is a key part of this whole thing. But, as a leader, how are you really going to get involved with your people when somebody made a mistake or when it could have been done better or whatever?
Right.
What do you need to do different in connecting with them so that radical, magical results happen?
Yeah. Yeah. And isn't it amazing, Randy, that it doesn't take a lot?
You know what? And that's what people don't realize. It doesn't take hardly anything, really. It just means do the right thing, say the right thing at the right spot.
That's it.
And you know what? You do that and it takes about 10 seconds and magical things happen.
Yeah.
And it's huge.
Well, this is why you're great at what you do. It's these little nuggets of information that sometimes we need as leaders just a reinforcement of all of this. And you've done it.
Well, we try to do so. I will say this, that I've learned an awful lot. And like I said, I've shared with you. I know when my autobiography comes out, it's going to be relating a lot of this. But I've been very fortunate enough to have worked with, through my career, worked with some of the most incredible leaders you'd ever imagine. And I learned a lot from them, not because of anything they ever told me, but because what I observed and how they interacted.
And that's the best way to learn.
It is.
In their
It
style.
is.
Yeah. How do we find you?
Well, on Wednesdays I'm here. No, I'm just sort of joking, but
We'll
yeah,
find
it's
the cockpit. I know that.
yeah. There you go.
Yeah.
But yeah, my website is coachingforrelevance.com, and on it has my email, randy@coachingforrelevance.com, and also my cell phone number there. People, if they want to kind of reach out, as I've said this on the shows a lot, and you know this, Steve, but I don't do sales pitches. So if you call me, I build relationships. I mean, if somebody calls and there's a need they have, yeah, we'll come up with something on that. But I like to build relationships and get a sense of that part of it. And if there's anybody that would like to reach out and literally just have a conversation, I'll welcome it.
Awesome. Yeah. You have a way of making things very clear and concise. And so I'm going to do it here. Great job, Randy.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I just got praise for you. Thanks.
And I mean it.
I appreciate it, buddy. And as you know, it's always honored to be on with you, and looking forward to doing it again.
Coachingforrelevance.com. Thanks a lot.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.